It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Basically, we're going to do a live edition of Take Command here to react to all of the news of the day. First of all, how you doing, buddy?
I'm excellent, man. Good to be talking to you, and it's going to be fun to talk about some of these moves.
Yeah, so I thought about just playing the full Take Command intro. I feel like that might be a little bit extra.
Probably a little bit.
But that's fine. We're just gonna get rolling here. So with that, let us dive into the news of the day, which changed dramatically before we started live on the radio. We had thought the news of the day was going to be the Javon Kinlaw signing, and who knows, maybe they do something else in free agency. And then, oh my God, they traded for Laremy Tunsil. The trade return, if you have not heard, is a fourth-round pick with Tunsil to Washington in exchange for 4 picks, the best of which is a 2026 second-round pick. Washington also gives up their third in the 2025 draft. Logan, let's just start with who Tunsil is as a football player at this point in his career. We know the Houston offensive line was bad last year. There was a lot of structural reasons why that happened. But is Laremy Tunsil still the top 5 tackle that he was universally thought of a couple years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there's a lot of things that like because of the protection stuff, because of like kind of the systematic stuff that's going on with the team and with the Houston Texans specifically, it's kind of tough to separate that evaluation. But when you watch him on a down to down basis, man, he's still special. He's still got a great feel for his pass protection. The line is excellent. The punch is excellent. The timing's excellent. The footwork's excellent. He's still athletic enough to get out in space. And quite frankly, I played with some pretty good left tackles in my career, and he is up there in terms of like talent, with very close to Trent Williams. Obviously, Trent Williams is a unicorn, but this guy's special, and I think it's special the opportunity that he affords the Washington Commanders now. Man, I'm really fired up about this opportunity. He's young. He's got a lot of football ahead of him. I think, because of the current cap situation, you feel really good about what he's going to bring and what they can build around him. But yeah, man, I think he is he's still got the juice, and I can't wait to watch how Kliff deploys him here in Washington.
Yeah, for sure. I think that he is, like, if you're talking about a top 5 tackle, we talked about how this team needs blue chippers. And ultimately, like, this is a blue chip guy. And you just don't have guys available very often that are this caliber of football player. And so with that being the case, I don't want to say you have to make this move, because like obviously you don't have to go trade 1 million draft picks or whatever. But like if you're looking to acquire this level of talent, and you were too good last year to acquire it probably in the draft, your options are just extremely limited. And in that way, like I like the other thing I've keep coming back to, as I've talked about this today, Logan, on the show, is ultimately you're just trying to get better as a football team. And when you went to the NFC Championship game, if you are better, hopefully that means you're going to the Super Bowl or winning the Super Bowl. And there's no doubt, we can talk about the price, and we will, but there's no doubt if they're better now, then Laremy Tunsil makes them better, and that, like, ultimately better is better, I guess, is the very long-winded point of that.
Yeah, and I think the main thing that I get out of this is, like, where else are you going to find a franchise left tackle, right? And everyone talks about, you can draft one at 29. I'm telling you right now, the options are going to be pretty slim. Like, Connerly from Oregon was probably a guy that would fall in that range, and he's still got a lot of work to do, a lot of elemental stuff to do. So you say, Little from Jacksonville resigns, Stanley from Baltimore resigns, Larry Jackson from LA resigns. Teams do not let serviceable, competent offensive linemen leave their building, right? So the only other way to get it is through trade. And so, obviously kudos to Adam Peters for making the phone call, finding an opportunity where the price tag for the existing team is getting a little bit too high. They need to extend some people down the road. You bring in a guy like Laremy Tunsil. And again, this is what it takes, right? This is what he did in San Francisco to bring Trent there. You got to find a team that's willing to dance. And every team knows and understands what the value of this player is. You got to kind of go out and put yourself out there. Because again, like, as much as people want to say go draft a left tackle, starting left tackle in the NFL, I'll tell you right now, every single player in this draft class, maybe with the exception of Armand Membou, is a little bit of a project, right? And so Armand Membou is not going to be there when you pick a 20. So I don't know how else you're going to get one. You got to go out and trade for it. And so this is the cost of doing business, and this is the benefit of having a quarterback on a rookie deal. You can do these types of things, build the team around him. And again, this was the thing that I kept coming back to as the big offseason narrative issue, is how do you get better on the offensive line? You need to upgrade. in my opinion, the left tackle spot. That's not an indictment of Brandon Coleman. I just think he was playing out of position a little bit, right? Now it gives you some flexibility. You got your cornerstone left tackle there. You got a great center. When Cosby's healthy, you got a right guard. 3 of the 5 pieces are exactly where you need them to be, and then you can kind of mix and match as needed with the other pieces you got. So to me, this is an essential move. This has to happen. I'm so glad it did happen because it raises the floor of the offense. Look no further than the Super Bowl. I know we tend to have like this immediate knee-jerk reaction to seeing people like in the Super Bowl specifically, oh my gosh, the offensive line's terrible, whatever. But that's with a young quarterback, with a guy that's going to change this organization's trajectory. You need to protect him. You need to keep him upright because when he's upright, he's a dangerous football player.
So the next step then is like, what about the rest of the line? I think that most folks think that Brandon Coleman could be a really good guard in this league. I know that's where you projected him initially coming out. Why do you think they ultimately decide to abandon the Brandon Coleman left tackle experiment? And then what's next for Brandon Coleman, whether it be left guard or right tackle? Like, what are the options here?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything's on the table for him. I think when you look at, again, I think he can play left guard. I think he can play right guard in a pinch. I think he can play right tackle. And I think when you look at his athletic measurables, I think that's exactly what you're kind of thinking about maybe long term. Maybe not week 1, but I think everything is on the table for him. And I think that's, again, good process by Adam Peters. Find a guy in the 3rd round that has some position flexibility, that has the athletic upside, that has the traits, that has the length. All those things you're hunting for an offensive lineman. And again, just talk about raising the floor, right? I don't think this means they don't draft an offensive lineman in the draft, but now that guy can be more developmental, more long-term, more kind of future looking. And I think, again, this is exactly what you needed in terms of offensive additions, right? At a cornerstone left tackle, you immediately get better at one of the other positions, whether it's right tackle or left guard. And then if you play, let's say he does play left guard, Allegretti can play right tackle until Cosmi gets back. And again, that's a serviceable group. And when you look at Jaden Daniels and how effective he is when he's not pressured, when he can see home, and you get those 5 guys playing at a super high level, it's awesome. And then you think about what it does for Kliff, man. I'd say look no further than San Francisco last year. I talked to someone who I thought was very bright this offseason and said, what was the issue with the offense? And it wasn't Brandon Ayuk, it wasn't Deebo Samuel, it wasn't Christian McCaffrey. The first thing out of his mouth was like, they lost the left tackle, and it's really negatively impacted their ability to call offensive plays. And so I look at that and I say, that's no longer an issue here as long as Laremy Tunsil stays healthy, and injury has not been an issue for him throughout his career. So to me, this is the move. It gives Cliff more flexibility, makes Jaden Daniels immediately better, it improves you in the run and the pass game. So whatever the cost was, and we'll talk about that in a second, man, like this is the move, and it needed to happen. And right now I feel so much better going into the 2025 season because of this.
So let's talk about the cost. And there's a meme from Fresh Prince where like Will Smith is just standing in the middle of the room eventually, and he's looking around and he's like, there's nobody here. And there is, I think, a little bit of fear that like 3 years from now, when some of these older guys retire and some of the older guys move on, or these contracts all of a sudden are not guys that you can spend on because you're paying Jaden Daniels more money than any other player in football, that like, then what? And obviously these are later problems. If you've won a Super Bowl, or even if you've been to 1 or 2, like, I think it justifies the experiment. The whole point is to win Lombardis. The whole point is to give yourself a chance. But there is, I think, reasonable limitations to say, like, eventually we do want to acknowledge that this is a long runway, hopefully, with Jaden Daniels. We would like to compete for a long, long time. What is the threshold, and how close are we to the threshold of giving away too many draft picks? Is they net lost 3 here? They obviously traded for Lattimore, and there's, traded for Deebo. Like, draft picks are meant to get good players. That's good. They've gotten theoretically good players with them, but eventually, like, you do want some of these guys on rookie deals because you want them here for a long time, not just a short time.
Yeah, and I think there's some of that forward-thinking process happening when you look at the trade deal for Laremy Tunsil specifically, right? You only give up, what is it, 1 pick in 2025, but you get 1 back, right, from the Houston Texans. So again, I think that's, again, understanding that I got to keep that first-round pick this year because I need to get a difference maker on probably now on the defensive line, I would assume. Obviously, we'll see what happens at that 29. You can trade out of that spot and then maybe accrue more draft capital. But I do think you see an awareness by Adam Peters to understand we need to get these pivotal pieces, right? These left tackle. We need to improve on the defense. But we need to make some of these moves, but we also need to make sure there's that scaffolding of youth that we can count on when Jaden Daniels is a high-priced free agent. Obviously, we're not going to let him go to free agency. They're going to give him an extension. But I think that, to me, that was another really good part of this deal. It's like, hey, man, let's make sure we reserve these 5 draft picks so that we can infuse good talent. We have the first. We kept our first next year. I think those are all good things. And then we can trade. We can make other moves for 2026 to make sure that we have enough draft capital to continue that process. So I do think there is an awareness. And again, the thing that I keep coming back to is I don't know how else you would have done it, right? So there's no other way around this for the offensive lineman specifically, right? There's no other way to get here without making this trade. And I just think the way they structured it was really, really smart because it still lets you get 5 really good pieces this year, especially looking at last year's draft. I think they did a great job in the first half of the draft. Obviously, quarterback Mike Sanderson, Donnie Newton, and then the back half, Dominique Hampton, Jordan McGee, John Baptiste, really good players that are going to contribute. So they've shown they can draft at the front and the back end at a high level, and Brandon Coleman as well. So we get another 5 opportunities at it, and to get 5 more people we can build this roster around, I think that shows really great awareness.
So I think it's important to clarify, we're hoping that Dominique Hampton's a good football player. We're hoping that Jordan McGee is. McGee showed some stuff on special teams last year. He plays like an animal. John Baptiste, for a 7th rounder, to be a part of the rotation in year 1 on defense at a tough position at edge, that's not nothing. He wasn't awesome, but he was fine. He was an end of rotation guy on the cheapest contract you can basically get in the entire league, which is fine. But those guys aren't done developing. You'd hope John Baptiste is a bigger role this year. We'll see what McGee can do. We'll see. Hampton's a guy I've thought about a lot in the last 24 hours. And you hear some of the stuff that you're hearing about. Do they want to play a little bit more man coverage? Is that why they didn't re-sign Chin? And a guy who they converted from safety to linebacker, you'd hope is pretty good in coverage for a linebacker, even if he wasn't necessarily, that was his strength as a safety. So hopefully that he can play a bigger role and these draft picks look good in the long term. And then obviously they have to do it again. But I think it's worth making that differentiation because some people are obviously people are up in arms about Sinnott because he's a 2nd round pick who didn't have a very good rookie year. But I think the other ones too, there are definitely people that are oh, are those guys even any good? And it's they're not all going to be good instantly. They're not all Jaden Daniels. Jaden goes into this our brain of what a rookie's supposed to be.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. And so the reason I brought up the draft picks and the value of draft picks is it gives you young, cost-controlled assets that have a runway to develop, like you're alluding to there. So when I see Dominique Hampton in the preseason, I see an NFL player. When I see a healthy Jordan McGee, I see an NFL player. Now, what is their ultimate role? That's still yet to be decided. But you have talented people with speed, athleticism, and length that fit and understand and are homegrown products that are leaders and can kind of identify what it means to be a commander. So I'm excited about that. I think there needs to be more of those guys. I look at kind of the last regime and how difficult it is now to have the kind of middle class scaffolding of this roster because you don't have your linebacker and Jordan Davis. You don't have that defensive lineman and big all those guys are gone because there was no development. I just think I'm excited about those guys I just mentioned because they can develop. There's an opportunity for them to improve, and I think that's where the ultimate value is for me and from my observation standpoint. Is just good to have people like that in the building, and hopefully they can do it again in this upcoming draft.
So, yes, and then I think when you look at this draft, what Adam has done is just he's walking a higher tightrope. And it's not that they don't have any draft picks. They are certainly at the lower end of, I think, what you'd want. But if he hits on the lottery tickets, if they go 5 for 5, shoot, if they go 4 for 5 in this draft and they wind up with just the 5, which also presumes that they don't make another trade on draft night or earlier to trade back and acquire more picks, which is still very much on the table, then it doesn't matter. Which was kind of the running joke, I think, at the end of the season. It's what can we learn from the Eagles? And it's hit every single one of your draft picks. If you can hit every single one of your draft picks, you will have no problems ever for the rest of time. And so, of course, that's an unreasonable expectation. But I do think it's worth pointing out that, if you are Adam, you've made your job difficult, but you've also made your job easier because you are not now all of a sudden taking these massive, wild upside swings on guys. Maybe you can just really be true to who you are and building your play style through the draft with guys that you hope will be around for a long time. And this is the curse of being good. You have to figure out how to acquire top-end talent without top-end draft assets. And especially in an NFL environment, Logan, as we talked about a little bit last week, and we've certainly talked about on the radio show as well, where free agency is thinner than it has ever been because you've had multiple years in a row where the cap has jumped more than anticipated. You get 20% cap jumps every year. Teams are going to be able to retain their players, which means if you want to go get someone else's player, you're going to have to do what they're doing. And because of the lack of talent that was left by the Rivera era, there are a couple guys, Cosme, Quan Martin, etc. There just aren't the blue chip guys. This team is kind of in a tough spot to surround Jaden. But if you have the Jaden piece, then everything else is much easier than finding the quarterback. So these are in some ways champagne problems.
Yeah, I think so. And I also, like you mentioned this draft, and I do think like if you want to be picking somewhere, it's probably like where the Commanders are picking. I don't think the top end is that quality. And I think like 29 is great. I think the second pick in that pick in the second round will be a great value piece. And obviously you got to hit on it and make it happen. But like you said, like this is the problem that good quarterbacks help you overcome, right? Like look at what Patrick Mahomes does, look what Joe Burrow does, look what Josh Allen does, right? Every year, every team goes in, they're like every pundit goes in, it's like, oh, the Bills aren't as good as they're supposed to be. The roster's not there. Shoot, Josh Allen figures it out, right? Same thing with Joe Burrow, same thing with Patrick Mahomes. Like this was one of the offensively one of the most kind of pieced together rosters for Kansas City. They figured it out because you got the guy at the most important position probably in all of sports. And so ultimately, like as much as we want to talk about, again, they're short on draft picks, they handled one of the biggest issues, which is getting a left tackle. And it's not just a left tackle, it's a good left tackle, a top 5 left tackle in the NFL. Those guys are not cheap. They're hard to come by. You're probably not going to get one in the draft. Like, think about how many left tackles have been drafted over the last couple of years that have hit and made it work, and there's not a lot of them. So this is why this is so exciting to me because it shows multiple levels of understanding by Adam Peters, right? It shows that he understands we have to get this. It's hard to get this guy. We're going to find a way to get it done. We're limited on draft assets. We're going to utilize them the way we want. We're going to get a playmaking wide receiver, right, in Deebo Samuel. We trust our training staff to keep him healthy, to keep him in shape. He's going to be motivated, ready to go. He's a Commanders-type player. I've worked with him before. And now we're going to allocate these other draft resources to make sure that we can get younger and more talented while we've made these other big moves. And again, it puts more stress on the scouting department, but that's why you got to make big-time decisions, like you're saying, when you're picking at the end of the first round and you're winning a lot of football games.
We are doing a Take Command live episode, essentially, here as Logan Paulsen is with us. The other big news of the day is Javon Kinlaw. 3 years, $45 million is the top line number. It's really a 2 for $30 deal. We'll see what the final structure is, but $30 million guaranteed, so likely kind of 2 for $30. I've started to watch a little bit of the tape, Logan. Very interesting player. And the idea of Javon Kinlaw is amazing. He hustles his face off. He can be physical. He can be violent. He's 6'5". He's 320 pounds. The reality of Javon Kinlaw is sometimes that 6'5" seems to work against him a little bit. And, a guy that is built like the prototypical run stuffer is actually probably a better pass rusher than he is a run defender. I know you've been watching some tape as well. What do you think of the Javon Kinlaw acquisition, both player and price?
Yeah, so I think obviously I think the defensive tackle, like interior pass rusher market is going to be a little bit elevated. I didn't see what Bill Williams got, but obviously Odigizua from Dallas got a lot of money too. So it's going to be elevated. So these guys that have any kind of upside on the interior are going to get paid because it's, again, like offensive linemen, it's harder to find these positions. So while I agree with you, I do think that there are some things to be desired from his play style, right? But when you look at him and he is big, he's physical, and if you can get him going in the right direction and kind of get it all targeted, I think it's going to work out really well for you. Now, the thing that I think is so interesting about this signing is on paper, I'm kind of like, it doesn't blow my socks off. But the one thing I do trust is that Dan Quinn, Adam Peters, this defensive staff, they've done a good job kind of rehoming guys that are very, very talented, have these measurables, and they kind of fit them into the scheme. So part of me is like, are they going to have him play just straight 3 technique, or is he going to do some kind of stuff on the perimeter the way they did with Holmes this year? And again, that might be more of a natural fit for him where he's finding better matchups. He can rush with power. He does have a tremendous get-off. There's a lot of issues with this game, but anything physical, length, strength, run straight, he is going to absolutely murder that. So if you can find a way to maximize his skill set, and we've talked about this ad nauseum, Dan and this staff has done such a great job of saying, hey, you don't do this thing well, but we trust that we can identify what you do well and get you in that role. So that's kind of what I'm hoping for here. Again, he's a former first round pick. The physical tools are there, right? The physical tools are there, but it's never quite clicked. I will say the last 3 games of last year were probably the best 3 games that I've seen played over the course of his career. So maybe it's kind of clicking at the right time. You're kind of buying low on an appreciating asset, maybe. But I also trust the staff to kind of get him coached up, get him right. I mean, look at what Ryan Kerrigan was able to do with that group of edge rushers last year, in addition to the defensive line coach, whose name escapes me at the moment. But those are things that I think I'm kind of betting on that as of right now, and hopefully that turns out for the best.
Yeah, Daryl Tapp
Thank you.
great job as the defensive line coach, along with Kerrigan on the edge. A couple things I think are worth pointing out / circling back to, underlining, whatever, underscoring that you just said. Kinlaw was hurt, I think it was 2 years ago, on the ACL. Maybe it was 3 years ago. So if he all of a sudden is rounding into form health-wise, that could be a boon. And these are like, admittedly, reasons for optimism. We can also go to the other side here in a second. But reasons for optimism. Finished last year extremely well. Great. Fantastic. Especially as he gets farther and farther away from an ACL injury. Goes into this offseason healthy. What can he do when he gets here with this training staff, with this strength staff, who got so much out of so many different guys last year? That's thing one. Thing two, just like you said, they know what role they want or they would not bring him in. And, I'm not saying that he's going to be their version of Zach Bond, where it's like, hey, we flip your role and now you're an all-pro defensive player of the year candidate. But I do think it's worth pointing out, they have starters at defensive tackle. Like, Jazon Newton was a second-round pick last year, and Daron Payne is still here. So this guy is probably your DT3, and is $15 million a lot for a DT3? Kind of. But also with the way the market is and the way the cap is risen, like we're talking about like 4 or 5% of the salary cap probably, depending on the structure of the deal, which is equivalent to what, 11, 10 million a couple years ago, which for a guy, and again, he's not your starter, but he's going to play 650, 70 or 700 snaps for you. Like that's a requisite value. That's fine. So that's part of it. 3. We know that Dan Quinn has liked to have, they used to call it, they used to have a name for it, and I was reading an article in the Sacramento Bee from like 2014 before the show that chronicled this. I think I can't remember it, but there was like a term for the big defensive end that the term has changed over the course of years, but Pete Carroll used it, and DQ got it from Pete, and they had a guy in Seattle that was like this, and we saw it last year with Payne.
Red Bryant.
Yeah, Red Bryant in Seattle. Who was, by the way, 6'5", 326 per Pro Football Reference. Kinlaw 6'5", 320. So literally the exact same kind of build. And we saw last year with John and Daron then put that defensive tackle player out on the edge. And that pass rush value, that size, that length, maybe he's not a great run stopper inside. Could he do a little bit more outside? So I think there's a lot of potential upside here. And the last thing I'll say is this, Logan. There's a clear bet on the character here. And Kinlaw was a guy who was drafted in the first round by San Francisco, by an organization that cares about that stuff. Then Robert Saleh, who was with him in San Francisco, saw some of the shortcomings and was like, I don't care. I want you in New York with me in a year where my job's on the line. Okay, he doesn't play great, but then Adam Peters is like, I want you here in DC after knowing you in San Francisco. That at the very least speaks well to the person. And considering this will be his age 27 into 28 season, a time when defensive tackles typically peak, I understand the bet. I'm not going to say that this is guaranteed to work. I'm not being like, this is the greatest move ever. I'm not even saying like, this is a great move, period. I just understand it. And I think like at the very least, that's worth something.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a really nice way to articulate that, actually. I think you highlighted like the pros and cons of it. He is getting better, still a young player. If it does hit, you're going to look like a genius, right? Because you're buying low, relatively speaking, to the rest of the market, and you're going to get a guy who's going to play significant minutes for you. Like, I don't know, like that seems like a pretty good deal right there. So, again, we'll see what happens. There's still a lot of offseason left. There's still a lot of kind of like, what is his actual role going to be? Like, where's he going to fit? How are they going to maximize him? But shoot, man, like when you get him going in the right direction, like he does flash. And so if you can just kind of increase the level of that production, of that kind of that variance that he brings in a positive way. And I think Darrell Tapp, he does a great job. You watch him do drills, pre-practice, you kind of see his energy, see the things he's coaching. This could be a really nice fit for him where it's like, hey man, just get off and go. Shut your brain off, let this rip and go get after it. big, fast, athletic dudes. If you get with the right coach, they can make you work, and in the right scheme, they can make you work too. Now, I agree with you. It's not a guaranteed 100% hit. There's a little bit of there's risk associated with it for sure. But if it does hit, man, you look like a genius.
And if it misses, I'm not gonna say who cares. 15 million is not nothing, but it's not something that like you are so screwed. How could you like? It's not a
Right.
contract that's gonna be like crazy prohibitive moving forward. Let's just do like a quick minute on. I'm gonna like do the say there's 5 other news items that are all Commanders adjacent. 3 guys that are coming back, 2 guys that are leaving. Bobby Wagner, you and I haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, but we can actually clump him and Zach Ertz together because to me, they're the same. They are force multipliers, guys that make everyone in that building better. And while they are not the best they've ever been, and they are not the best currently at their position, they are still very good football players that can help you right now. And I think they got really solid value, frankly, for both of them. Like fair market value, good deal for player, good deal for team. And that's the kind of thing that you want. Hey, you play well, we're going to bring you back. You're a great citizen, we're going to bring you back. And that's what they did with both these guys.
I totally agree, man. And I think when you talk about like kind of the influx of new pieces, whether it's in free agency, obviously Laremy and Javon are coming here, right? You need those pillars, those leadership pillars, guys you can point to and say, hey, you guys are all new, but that's a Hall of Fame middle linebacker right there. And look how he does it, right? Look at the way he practices. Look at the way he studies. Look at the way he preps. Look at the way Zach preps, man. I mean, holy cow, like to get him at the number that they got him at, I thought was excellent, right? Because he was so good last year. But to get that leadership back offensively, another year of mentorship, anybody in that offense, specifically Ben Sinnott, I think is fantastic. So to your point, it's exactly what you want, and I think it's essential for the cultural elements of this team moving forward, which is so important, per Dan Quinn and Adam Peters.
For sure. All right, next guy is your tight end, Y tight end brethren, John Bates. Logan, as the king of the Y tight end in Washington media, you are a happy man with John Bates returning. Why?
I mean, to say I'm happy is an understatement. I'm ecstatic, man. Like he like his value is never going to show up on a stat sheet, but to get that physical, tough, smart football player back in the building. Last year, the number one blocking Y went like $3 million. Like it's a valuable position in the NFL. People want this in their offense. So to get a guy homegrown, good length, good size, good understanding of run schemes, can compete with big defensive ends in line. Like this does so much for your run scheme. It elevates tremendously. And again, it's not going to show up in the stat sheet, but it'll show up in the rushing totals at the end of the year, the pass protection numbers at the end of the year. And I just love the way he preps and the way he prepares. And to get him and Zach back in the same room is fantastic.
No doubt about that. And now the pressure's on for Sinnott, but I also think that like tight end in the draft could be possible for them. So we'll see. That's certainly something we'll be monitoring on Take Command and on the Hoffman Show. All right, 2 guys that are exiting. One is, I think, fairly surprising. We'll start there. Jeremy Chinn was a guy that I thought they would definitely try to bring back. He ultimately signs a 2-year deal with the Raiders at a number is about $8 million per year. That is not crazy. Safety, there actually are some good players available, and the safety market was super weird last year as well. But what do you make of them letting Chinn out the door, and what options either internally? I feel like you're a little higher on Percy Butler than I am. Tyler Owens is floating around, but then you also have some guys, whether it's a big ticket item like a Javon Holland or some guys down the list that could be really interesting. And what do you think they're looking for to replace Jeremy Chinn?
Yeah, so I think you bring up a great point. I think there's a lot of bodies that have shown that they can get it done at a high level in the building. Like Percy Butler is Derek Forrest is a guy that comes to mind too. Dominique Hampton comes to mind. Tyler Owens once he figures it out, right? Like they've got some big. Ben Nichols is a big guy in practice squad, but they've got this big body archetype in the building. And so I look at that and I say, okay, there's people here that can get it done. They're maybe not as well as Jeremy could, but they've got talent in the building that they can develop, right? I look at the free agent. It's saturated with big. I know it's kind of a down year for edge rushers, defensive tackles, offensive line, running back, things that we've talked about, but it's saturated, and there's some really good football players in there. So maybe we get a guy that fits at a better price point, especially if we're making some of these big financial moves. We got to be a little bit wise with how we're spending money. And then look at the draft, and there are some absolute dogs in this draft that play the safety position. So to me, this is not an indictment of Jeremy Chinn. I think they did the right thing. Let him go out, test the market. He says, I got this. You say, quite frankly, we're not willing to pay that. That's not an indictment of what you did for us. It's just we want to invest these assets in other areas. I think it's also important to understand, man, safety by NFL standards is not a premium position, right? It's not a premium position. They don't affect the play on every single down. So you can get away with kind of, hey, bargain bin shopping, finding the right fit for you. So that's what I'd say about that. Obviously, we're bummed to see Laremy Tunsil leave. He's a great asset for this team last year. Great to see him kind of resurge and get back to the level he was known for in Carolina. But I think the guys in-house, the guys in the draft, the guys in free agency are the reason that he's walking, basically.
Yeah, definitely, and they've got options now. We'll see which one they go. Defoe's a great call, by the way. You almost forget that he's around, but this is a starting caliber safety a couple of years ago, and showed last year in some fill-in spots that he still can play at a high level. That maybe he's not too indifferent from Chin, and maybe they saw that not enough to replace Jeremy last year, but they're like, if we got to, we'll see if Defoe can get on that page or if he's in the mix coming up when practice opens for OTAs in a couple months. All right, last but not least, Dyami Brown, Jacksonville, $10 million. That is a number I certainly would have been willing to pay. He might have liked the role in Jacksonville better. They might think they can do better. There are definitely options available in free agency. Guys like Darius Slayton. They've got Noah Brown they could bring back, who was ahead of Dyami on the depth chart, obviously, last year until he got hurt. But Dyami ultimately, good for him, man. $10 million if he goes and balls out in Jacksonville in a system, by the way, that I think is going to be very good to him. He can play off of Brian Thomas Jr. We saw how well he played off of Terry last year, and Liam Cohen might be the best screen designer in the league, and we saw how good Dyami was on that. So good for Dyami, but where does this leave the Commanders, and what do you make of that move?
I mean, this is one of the issues, right? When you do well and a young player does well, especially going into the playoffs, especially with a guy who's got some vertical juice, man. Those guys are hard to find. You know what I mean? And I know receivers are kind of a dime a dozen now, but good for him, man. He played well when he needed to play well, and I'm sure that the Commanders were. It feels to me like Dyami wanted a 1-year prove-it deal. I would assume the Commanders wanted to tie him into something longer. I don't know that for sure. That's just my thought. And again, this is probably the right situation for him. So good on you. I think there's other opportunities as well. I think you look at what Zacchaeus did last year, what Noah Brown did last year. Were they as effective as Dyami late in the season? No. But are they still effective pros, and can they get the job done at a high level? Yes. And we talk about this all the time, Craig. As much as receiver is an appreciating asset if you're in that kind of top 10 group in the NFL, there are a ton of receivers in the draft that are really good football players that can do what you need a player like this to do. And I understand we have depreciating draft assets in terms of number. However, I look at this and say, there are guys. You can find a guy opposite Terry McLaurin to supplement Deebo Samuel that does whatever they need you to do, and you can find your type, pick them out, and say, this is going to be our guy. And so, again, I was looking at receivers a couple weeks ago for the draft, and I'm like, there's a kid from Nebraska who's no one talking about. He'll be available in the 6th round. Take him. He's going to run. He ran a 4.4. He's 6'5". He's 220. No one's talking about him, right? So you can find those pieces in the draft, develop. He's not going to be the number one target getter, and I understand that. But I would just say receiver's funny that way. And good for Dyami to get the contract, but there's other opportunities, other assets, and I think that's probably the direction Adam Peters is going.
Yeah, it's important not to confuse familiarity with goodness, and I think sometimes we all do that. We know this guy, but there's other guys out there that we don't know that will be just fine, and if they come here, we'll know them next year and not want them to leave, because that's how this goes. All right, that is the first ever Take Command live, essentially, podcast on the radio. It's just us talking football. It's no different than what we do when we record it. Just we can't cuss and bleep it out later because we're live on the radio. That's Logan Paulsen, everybody. Of course, you know him. He played 10 years in the NFL, and we do our pod a couple times a week. We'll probably do more podding if news breaks, so make sure you subscribe to Take Command wherever you get your podcast. Logan, appreciate you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on, man. Great show.